how do you make sure those customers are happy? How do you create so much competitive advantage that people love what you're doing and won't flip to, what ultimately became a lot of competitors? So everything in our business was about making customers happy. And it wasn't because that's kind of a fun, moral rallying cry that people put in their annual reports. It was because customer retention was at the center, the complete center of our ability to grow customer retention and expansion.
Greetings, I'm Keith Klein, the host of the VentureFizz podcast, where I interview the most fascinating people in the tech scene. Okay, this is amazing. I am so excited to announce that with this episode, we have hit a new milestone, and that is 300 episodes of the VentureFizz podcast. So for episode 300, I couldn't think of a better guest than Diane Hessan, entrepreneur, investor, board member, and columnist. Diane has accomplished so much throughout her career, and during this interview, she shares so many great stories from each step along the way, including building Communispace, now called C-Space, which was the first company to leverage social media for consumer insights. We had a lot of ground to cover, so we discuss a lot, including Diane's background story growing up in Pennsylvania and why she completed her undergrad at Tufts in 3 years, plus the story of her very unique application to Harvard Business School, her career path as a brand manager for General Foods and later rising through the ranks at the Forum Corporation, the full story of Communispace and how the company pivoted and disrupted the market research industry, which led to an acquisition, authoring a book and becoming a nationally recognized expert on the American voter, serving on the board of directors at companies like Panera Bread, Bright Cove, Easter Bank, and others, what it's like giving a commencement address, saying yes, and the importance of serendipity, and so much more. All right, without further ado, here's my interview with Diane. Diane, thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be here, Keith.
I'm so excited. I feel like this conversation is long overdue for at least the VentureFizz podcast. I know you've been on other podcasts, but I'm like, I need to have Diane on my podcast. So I'm really excited to talk to you because the Communispace story is just an amazing one, very inspirational. But before we get into your background story and everything that you've built as far as all the great activities in the Boston tech scene and beyond, I did want to talk about something that I was kind of thinking about as I was preparing for this conversation. And Communispace, back when that started, this was, if I'm not wrong, like 1999, 2000 timeframe. It was really focused around content, commerce, and community around the web. And when I was thinking, I'm like, it's 2023. Yeah, the 3 C's. So it's many, many years later. We're 2023, yet those are 3 things that are still very core and very relevant. So I just thought that was interesting how, the web is still focused on those core pieces.
I guess if you just take content, for instance, I mean, in 2000, what they were saying about content was just think, you will no longer need an encyclopedia because all of the information on the web will be at your fingertips. And so I guess what we talked about in 2000 when it came to content is what the internet would replace. It was, so first it was replacement. You don't need a dictionary anymore. You don't need an encyclopedia anymore. And then there was a long period when I think the web was about redesigning content. And this was much later, but I remember once seeing a prototype of what an ESPN website would look like. I know you and I are both sports fans. Yeah. And it had blocks. It was in squares, and it had video and headlines and color and incredible photos. And I had never seen anything like that, but that was kind of phase 2. Like the content was reinvented with the web, in ways that were never even possible before. And, of course, now there are all new ways of creating and distributing content. I don't know, maybe that's what will happen with AI. Like right now we're looking at AI as what it replaces, right? I mean, you don't do your term paper anymore. AI will do your term paper for you. And then at some point, we'll think about how it redesigns things, how it enables us to do things that are just dramatically better than anything else. So, AI supplementing the real world and creating something new, but, then at some point it will be the thing. But, there are all those stages.
Yeah. And when I think about because community, I remember it was about a couple of years ago when people were like, you need a community strategy just because you saw
Mhm.
certain companies that thrived around building communities for a B2B model, not
Mhm.
just B2C. So it's just interesting that, community content and commerce is never going to be things that disappear. They'll just be evolution of how they, operate on the web.
Yeah. And we'll argue over which one is more important.
Right. Exactly. So, well, let's rewind the clock. So, where did you grow up? What were you like as a child?
Where did I grow up? I grew up in Norristown, Pennsylvania, which is about 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia. Um, Norristown was a steel town. People always called it the wrong side of the tracks. Um, Although we always laugh because the only town that was worse than Norristown was Conshohocken, which was right next door. And now Norristown is still pretty gritty, but Conshohocken is young,
It's hip.
um,
It's hip.
and hip,
Yep.
with beautiful little shops and everything. And my parents used to say, if you don't work hard, you can end up in Conshohocken. And that actually probably would have been a good thing. Um, my dad uh, was a sewing machine repairman, and my mom was the secretary in the library of our junior high school. Um, I always kind of loved being engaged with everything. I mean, I was a good student. I think now in retrospect, I feel like maybe my motivation was I just wanted to leave Norristown and have a better life than my parents had and everything. I was always involved in a lot of things, sports activities, all of that. I think my experience growing up in Norristown, I'm not trying to make it sound like it was this really difficult, sad thing. I mean, we didn't have a lot. We had cereal for dinner a lot. I would say, oh, I hear there's this thing called camp during the summer. My mom would point to our, 10-foot by 10-foot backyard and go, that's camp.
That's
But I will
camp.
tell you that I had a really happy childhood.
Yeah.
And it's helped me in the 25 years or so that I was an entrepreneur. It really helped because, you always say when you have difficult times, what's the worst thing that could happen? What's the
Mhm.
worst thing that could happen? And for me, my worst case scenario was that I'd be back in Norristown, and I'd be a barista. And that would have been okay for me because, growing up was a lot of fun. So having that kind of childhood made me fear less. It made me way more able to take risks just because, my worst case scenario was a lot better than, many people in this world.
So, how'd you end up at Tufts?
I read an article that said that there were more colleges and universities in Boston
Hmm.
than anywhere else. And my dad and I got into his pickup truck and we drove to Boston. And I went all over the place looking at schools. And when I went to Tufts, I just thought that it was such a beautiful campus. And I went on to the roof of the library, which now is way more beautiful than it was then. But I went onto the roof of the library in this, kind of bucolic setting. And in the distance was the city of Boston. I thought, oh my gosh, if I come here, right, I get to be on this beautiful campus and yet I get to see the excitement of this wonderful city at the same time. And I think that trip to the library roof just kind of did it for me.
Yeah.
Um, and here I am many, many years later, and, I still really love the place. So it
Yeah.
was
Tufts.
great. And obviously, as you can imagine, it completely changed my life.
Yeah, that's amazing, amazing school. And then you pursued your MBA at HBS right after, right?
I did, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was 20 when I went into HBS. Um,
Wow.
Part of it was, I had a lot of financial aid for college. And the way they did it in those days was you had government aid and they gave you 4 years of aid no matter what you did. And so I figured out that if I finished Tufts in 3 years and then kept going, I'd get a whole year of financial aid
Hmm.
to kind of get me, into graduate school. So I used to write on my business school applications, don't defer me. Like deferring was one thing if you were young, because I have to use this year. I'm going, where somebody will actually take me. And, it's weird, Keith. So So here's what I think happened, how I got in at age 20. I wrote my application in calligraphy.
You
And
did.
so, I mean, my grades were good, my boards were good and everything, but I wasn't
Yeah.
like, I mean, I don't think I was the most spectacular candidate in the world, but my application was gorgeous. And so I had this vision that what happened is the whole committee was all together and they made their decision about who was in the class, and I wasn't in it. And then as they were walking out the door, somebody said, let's take that calligrapher. And that's what I think happened. I should probably go check it out. There's got to be some reason that it's documented somewhere over at HBS. But, I think that's what happened. So,
It's hanging up in the admissions office somewhere where they're like, remember that student that wrote their
right,
application
what
in
happened to
calligraphy?
her?
Right, we need more students like that.
Yeah.
That's
But,
funny.
again, when we were talking about risk stuff, I went there at age 20 and there were a lot of things I didn't know. I mean, I didn't know a lot about the stock market. I didn't understand what it was like for the Dow to hit 1,000, which it did while I was there. But again, the risk there was not so great. So many people in my class, were married with families and gave up jobs to come there. So the
Mhm.
risk of going was so high. For me, I just moved from my dorm in Medford, to my dorm in Alston. And
Right.
I think it made things easier because I had a clear head and I wasn't freaking out over, what would happen if I didn't crack the case.
All right. So how'd you get your career started?
Um, oh, I fumbled around a lot. I didn't have a lot of guidance, but I don't even think it was related to guidance. I think I'm just one of those people that never really knew what I wanted to do. I had a younger brother who was super clear, got a plastic black doctor kit when he was 2 years old and decided he wanted to be a surgeon then and never really changed his trajectory. And for me, I never knew. I never knew what I wanted to major in. I never knew what I wanted to be when I grew up. So I just kind of hopped around. I hopped around to different things. After business school, I did a stint at General Foods because I liked marketing. I thought that consumer goods was great. Um, I didn't know what product I wanted to work on. I said, give me anything as long as I understand the product. They said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, don't give me decaffeinated coffee because I don't get decaffeinated coffee. Like, why would anybody want to, drink something that tastes awful if it doesn't deliver the primary benefit? And in their infinite wisdom, they put me on room decaffeinated coffee. And it was the beginning of my journey into, one of my big life's passions, which is helping to understand people who are very different from me. And, so I loved it there. I moved back to Boston for a guy and didn't really have a job when I got here. There's a long story that I won't bore you with. I had a job offer at Gillette, but the guy who hired me withdrew the offer when he had a second conversation with me and his boss. The boss said to me, Diane, what's your biggest trepidation about taking this job? And I said, well, none other than the usual in consumer packaged goods, like why, spend 60 hours a week marketing soft and dry deodorant. But other than that, I'm excited about working for Gillette. And he didn't laugh the way you're laughing. He withdrew the
Right.
job offer. So I
Yeah.
went into consulting, which is what you do when you lose your job. And I did that for about 3 years, then spent a significant amount of time in a company that I love called the Forum Corporation, which was designing and developing management and sales and customer service training programs for industry. And it was a great introduction for me to B2B businesses and selling and marketing intangibles and the incredible power of what happens when you sit in a room for 3 days and, learn how to build skills, whether it's learning how to sell better or manage better or whatever. It was a really fun business in those days. And we grew really fast and I had lots of different jobs there. And, that was again, another really transformational experience. Just loved being in that business and, working with a lot of fun people and kind of honing my skills as a manager. I was chief marketing officer. I was head of sales. I did a big international stint. I did strategic alliances. I started a new business division. I mean, I had lots and lots of, when a company is growing, it's great because your job is not to say, what's my next step? Your job is to say, can I even keep up? Can I do my current job in a company that's twice the size? And I just built a lot of great skills then, just kind of in preparation for doing my own thing.
Well, and I think that's important. I think it's, it's inspirational for a lot of people that, wow, because I think, according to LinkedIn, you were at that company for 19 years?
Yeah, 18.
18,
Yeah.
so it
Yeah,
was
it
a
was
good,
amazing.
yeah, it was a pillar of your foundation. I think some people that would love to take the entrepreneurial leap, it's hard to do that, right? Like, it's a risk, what if it doesn't work out? Yet,
Yeah.
what led you down the path of being like, okay, I'm going to go start my own thing. And how'd you come up with the idea?
Yeah. I mean, the big turning point for me was I told you I had all these jobs and I did really well and I moved to into very senior management. I was one of the top 3 or 4 people in the company, and my boss, who was probably the best mentor I've ever had in my life and whose every word I hung on, one day I had my performance review and he had hinted to the company that he might step aside and become chairman and put somebody else in the CEO seat. So, of course, I practiced for hours the night before. And at the end of what was a really great performance review, I looked at him and I said, John, I'm not trying to kick you out, but if you decide you want to become chairman, I think I would be a great next CEO. So there's silence. And he said to me, Diane, someday you are going to be a great CEO, but right now you're a work in progress. And Keith, I was heartbroken, right? I mean, here, I thought it was a great idea. And I started to obsess over that because I told you, I never really knew what I wanted to do. And all of a sudden, what became clear to me was that I was really ready to lead an organization, that
Right.
I wanted to be a CEO. And I thought I had the skills and the tools and the ability to do that. So I started saying to my friends, let's get out of here. Like, let's build the kind of company we always wanted to work in. And, they'd all say, oh, Diane, if you ever do that, you should let me know because I would totally come with you. But they didn't have my dream. And so the reason I became an entrepreneur was not that I had a great idea. It was because I wanted to be a CEO and entrepreneurship was the fastest path for me to do that. And of course, I didn't want to be a CEO of a 3 or 4 person company. I wanted to be the CEO of a large company, with hundreds and hundreds of people all over the world, because that's what I loved being a part of in this other job. So I wanted to be a CEO, and my incentive to scale the business was I wanted to be able to walk around and see lots of people and, inspire others and really build an institution that mattered. I used to call it making a dent in the universe. So, some of my friends, that's not why they become entrepreneurs. They have an idea, they build an app, they sell it to PayPal.
Right.
Have another idea, they build an app, they sell it to Twitter or whatever. I mean, that was not me. The idea of building something and flipping it. And the turn on there is the idea of just being able to create massive value really quickly with your own skills. And I think that's a great motivation. It just wasn't mine. I just wanted to lead something big. And I obsessed over that until, it kind of happened.
So how'd you come up with that original idea for Communispace?
Well, my original idea was different. We were talking about the 3 C's. So my
Exactly.
original
Yep.
idea was the community in 2000 was really, if anybody who's listening to this who's, age 30 or over probably had the exact same first experience with community, at least if you live in the US, which is that you had an AOL account.
Right.
And we had chat rooms and we had instant messaging. And I was fascinated by this notion of leveraging the web by the whole notion of being able to have conversations with other people. there were not a lot of applications of community in a B2B setting. There was a lot of tennis.com and all of those things. So we decided to leverage community so that people within corporations could have conversations with each other, kind of an early version of, I don't know,
Slack. This is
Microsoft Teams,
Slack.
Slack, anything like that. That's what we
Yeah,
were building, but we were
totally.
building communities of people all over the world, and they were allowed to have discussions and send each other documents and do all of that. We were very excited about it. I didn't know a lot about how to write software, but I knew a lot at that point about how to sell. We got a bunch of great big names, like Sara Lee and like Chase Manhattan Bank in the beginning, and our clients loved our idea. I closed a bunch of deals for pilots. We raised 10 million in venture capital based on all of that, and we were off and running. And there were other people who were trying to do the same thing. It was called collaborative software at the time. We just couldn't figure out how to. I mean, people would come into the community, but the communities were mostly dead. I mean, people just didn't see it as a critical part of their jobs at the time. And we basically pivoted. I mean, I was at a client's in Kansas City, Hallmark, the greeting card company, and the client was about to launch an online community of all of their store managers so that they could all share ideas with each other. I guess kind of like Slack, let's figure out how we help each other merchandise better, improve the quality of our stores, improve the profitability, et cetera. And we were excited about it. The client looked at me and said, Diane, I love what you guys are doing, but I'm just worried nobody's going to come into this community. And fortunately, I wasn't 25 years old at the time. So I didn't, I had been through a lot of those sorts of situations. I just looked at him and said, I'm worried nobody's going to come into the community either. And he said the magic words, which are, I think I have a better idea. And he said, look, we're a card company. It's, the internet age. Maybe people won't send greeting cards anymore. We have a lot of innovation work to do. What about, instead of putting our employees in this community, what if we brought our target consumers, moms, into this community, and we picked their brains and understood their lives and their dreams and their frustrations, and ask them questions and ask them to come up with new product ideas. And you get the idea. And I did get the idea. I had done a lot of work helping companies understand their consumers, and I came back to our offices in Cambridge and said, okay, we're going to try something totally new.
Okay,
And
wait, before you get into this, because I want to unpack, because the Chase Manhattan, the first version of your product, from what I gathered and hearing this on other podcasts, is people were going, you would present
people loved
at,
it.
so you had 200 HR people that this was getting rolled out to at Chase Manhattan that
Yes.
were screaming, yeah, you presented, this is what we're going to build, collaborate, and people were going crazy, right?
Yeah. So Chase
Excited.
had 200 HR human resources people all over the world. They all came together. We had sold this because they came together once every 2 years on Wall Street to get together, and they'd share ideas and they'd listen to seminars. And when they left, for those of you who remember what work life was like then, you would get a piece of paper with everybody's contact information. It would have their name and their phone number, and sometimes their email address. We started adding email addresses, and you stayed in touch with people that way because you had that document. So
Right.
they brought me in at the end of this meeting, and I said, look, that piece of paper, you're not going to need it anymore. We're going to put you in an online community called the Chase HR Network, and you'll be able to be connected to each other all the time. You can ask each other questions. You can share experiences. You can send your favorite documents. You can just get to know each other better and just be that much more powerful. People went crazy. We got a standing ovation. And I thought, oh my gosh, how gratifying is this to be building something where the users are so incredibly excited. They couldn't wait until we launched. We hopped on the train. My head of product and our senior engineer were high-fiving each other, saying this is just going to be great. And Yeah, basically we launched the community about 2 weeks later, and at the end of that first week, out of the 200, 8 had come into the community. And, I thought jet lag. I mean, we tried everything. I mean, we called them on the phone. Oh, yeah, I love that thing. I'm going to totally come in. I mean, we just couldn't figure it out. We tried everything. And people loved it, but we couldn't figure out how to wire it into their jobs in those days. They had a lot of their own networks. And even when we had somebody kind of facilitating the conversation, like calling somebody and saying, Keith, you should come into this community because somebody's asking about something that, in compensation that you're really expert in. I mean, it just didn't happen. And there were articles in those days. The space was called knowledge management. There were articles that said, if you could get 10 people to come in once a week, that would be really great. I thought that would be really dead. I thought that was awful. And when we tried this Hallmark thing, in the first 24 hours, out of the 200 moms that we had recruited into the community, almost all of them came in.
Yeah.
And they were excited to be there. They could not believe they were going to be giving advice to Hallmark about how to move into the future. The client is reading everything. This guy named Tom Brailsford, he's like calling me 3 and 4 times a day. Did you see what that one said? Did you see what that one said? I've never heard this stuff before. So we, based on the fact that the first set of communities were pretty dead and this Hallmark thing was outrageously vibrant, I pulled 6 people off of their jobs. I gave them 45 days before the next board meeting to try to figure out what this is. Like, who buys this? Does anybody else do this? I mean, all the stuff you get in Business Planning 101. And in February of 2001, we made a recommendation to the board to pivot the company and get into the consumer space. The board didn't really get what we were doing, but we came up, along with our client, we came up with this phrase called focus group on steroids. And I said that, and on the board, they just started laughing, like that. My colleagues were saying, Diane, don't say that, don't relate it to focus groups. People hate focus groups. But whenever I said it to people, they got it. Like, why put 10 people in a room with a one-way mirror for an hour when you could have hundreds of consumers kind of in a virtual room available to have conversations with you whenever and wherever you wanted? And people got that, and they were nodding their heads. And, we did a pivot right into what ultimately was part of the market research space, helping brands get insight and inspiration from their customers because of the magic of this new thing called the internet. And now that space is probably $1 billion space in market research, but we were the first ones. Everybody thought we were frauds. I mean, people thought it was crazy, all kinds of objections, right? These people aren't representative. Who are these people? No one's on the internet yet. How do you know that, how do you know they're telling you the truth? I mean, we had a lot of work that we needed to do, but we ultimately figured it out, and it was just an absolute blast.
Well, I think what's important there is like you didn't fall into that trap of that false positive, because you had this buyers and people celebrating what you were rolling out, yet crickets when you actually rolled it out. So the use case didn't work out. But a lot of entrepreneurs probably just, hey, we're selling this and we can just keep, like, eventually someone's going to use it, right? But no, you were smart enough to listen to a customer, Hallmark, and pivot in a direction that was unknown, and obviously use the same foundation of technology, I would assume, just make it consumer and, obviously build a company.
Yeah, it's funny because we all give conflicting advice to entrepreneurs. I mean, sometimes I say to entrepreneurs, you better love what you're doing, because you're going to eat, sleep, and breathe that. You're going to be talking about it 24/7. You're going to be raising money talking about it. I mean, you need to have passion for what you're doing. It's so critical. Or forget it. I mean, you have like the worst life because that's all there is. On the other hand, you can't love it too much, because what if it's not the thing? What if it's something else? And I have found, most of my friends who become successful entrepreneurs, especially in tech, have pivoted. Maybe they thought it was B2C and it became B2B. Maybe there was a little feature of their product that ended up being the thing that people loved, as opposed to the thing that you loved. So I think you got to hit that balance. You got to love what you're doing, but you've got to also love the possibility that it could morph into something else.
Now, you built a company and you had to weather some ups and downs, right? You had the internet bubble, 9/11.
Oh, yeah.
There's just lots of things that happen while building a business. So what were some of the biggest lessons learned while building the company?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, we had I always say to people, we had 3 or 4 years of just horror, followed by, 10 years of glory. In the beginning, we had 2 near-death experiences, meaning we almost had no cash, and we had a massive case of employee fraud. We had so many difficult things going on. We had September 11th, which kind of stopped industry. And sometimes people will say to me, so what do you think is really critical as an entrepreneur? And I think I just didn't quit. I just didn't quit. I mean, I wanted to do this so badly that I just, we tried everything and we held on. And I think even in terms of my investors, I think my investors were really not happy with our results in the beginning, but I think they knew that they just believed that I would figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that really helped. Keep up over the long haul. I think in terms of scaling, and the biggest lesson I learned, I think you have to have a business model that really works. And then I think you need to set your company up so that that business model feeds into that. So for instance, here's how Communispace worked. For one community, let's say we were doing that Hallmark community. Eventually, we weren't just selling the software. We learned that if we layered in services, because clients didn't have time to run the communities. So people would say to us, okay, we have this software. Can you facilitate the community so that we don't have to have it? Or can you analyze the data that is coming through about consumers so that we don't have to do it? Or can you send people Amazon gift cards, if they participate? Like everything that it took to make the community work was something clients didn't have the time for. And so we learned that instead of charging $5,000 a month for the software, we could charge $20,000 a month for the software with all of those other services layered in. So we figured that out, and that was the beginning of really growing, not just selling the software, but selling everything else in there. So think about it. Hallmark's got a mom's community. They're paying us $20,000 a month. So a 1-year contract is $240,000. Okay. And everybody says, wow, this is a subscription model. This is really great. Here's the thing. If the client loves it, then they say, I would not only like a mom's community, I would like a millennials community, or I would like a creative craftspeople community, et cetera, et cetera. We just kept going, or I would like a Latina community. So all of a sudden, instead of one, we had 4 communities. Maybe we gave them a little bit of a discount, right? But let's assume no discount yet. You have $80,000 a month instead of $20,000 a month because the client loves it and wants to learn about more consumers. And then if they feel like you're in a long-term relationship, instead of 1 year, all of a sudden they sign a 3-year contract.
Mm-hmm.
So you get a contract from a happy client that is 3 or 4 communities for 3 years instead of a measly $240,000. And you tear that apart. And one of the ways that we scaled the business quickly was to figure that out, that a happy customer was kind of the center of our flywheel. And the other part of it was, okay, so if we did business with small companies, that business model didn't work because a small company couldn't afford. They could barely afford $240,000 a year, no less. 480, no less 720. So smaller companies would call us. I'd say we're totally over-engineered for you. So we didn't get distracted by that. But big companies could not only afford $240,000 a year, but they could afford 2.4 million a year. And it was very often still 0.001% of their marketing budget. So then the question becomes, how do you make sure those customers are happy? How do you create so much competitive advantage that people love what you're doing and won't flip to, what ultimately became a lot of competitors? So everything in our business was about making customers happy. And it wasn't because that's kind of a fun, moral rallying cry that people put in their annual reports. It was because customer retention was at the center, the complete center of our ability to grow customer retention and expansion. And, we got our first $1 million account, and I'd look at everybody and say, let's run the numbers. Like, what does a $5 million account look like? Everybody's like, oh, Diane, nothing's ever good enough for you. And I was like, really? Like, we could probably do this. How many communities would we need? How many services would we need? How long would we have to sign a contract for? How many other people? Hallmark's a large corporation. We didn't have to work just with one client. There are multiple divisions and everything. So we grew by building our product and our services and having people who just created such a great experience for clients that they talked about us, they were references, and they just couldn't get enough of us. I remember once I had a competitor, I saw him at a conference, and he said to me, Diane, I just have to tell you, I tell my sales force, don't even call on Communispace clients. And I said, Andrew, why is that? And he goes, it's like a cult. Right? It's like it's a complete waste of time. They're just like madly in love with you. And, we were in love with them. I mean, I'm still in touch with tons and tons of clients, but that's what took us all of a sudden into, when we figured that out, our sales were like 2.5 million, 5.5 million, 7.5 million. And then all of a sudden it went to like 20.3. 45, 80, etc. I mean, it just kept going then. Not just because we had the business model, but because we had mastered what was at the core of scaling the business, which was getting clients to absolutely love the value of what they were getting from us. So
Now, well, fast forward,
really
like the company ended up getting acquired by Omnicom in 2011, I believe.
Yeah.
So I'm always fascinated, like how does that happen? Like,
Yeah.
is like a company just kind of like saying, hey, just want to like talk about some strategic conversations and partnerships that lead down the path, like, or is it like, hey, we're really interested, like this is a missing piece of our business, and like how does that conversation even like start?
Yeah. Well, for a while, I thought we would do an IPO. And what happened was, I had another client, a guy named Stan Stananathan, who was at Coca-Cola. He was the head of all consumer insights at Coca-Cola. And I thought they loved what we were doing for them. I mean, we were helping them understand the youth of the world. The stuff that was coming out of our community was miraculous. Actually, no, at the time we were helping them understand the youth of America. So one night I'm having dinner with Stan. I go down to Atlanta. I know they're really happy. I figure he's paying for dinner. And he says to me, Diane, I have some advice for you. You got to write this down. He said, so here's the thing. There's no one in the industry who can do what Communispace does as well as you guys do it. But here's the problem. There are other companies now getting into your business, and many of them are in like 93 countries. And just in case you hadn't noticed, Coca-Cola's in 93 countries, and you guys are in like 2.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to figure out how to be global fast, because your competitors are going to start coming to me saying, Stan, we're not as good as Communispace is, but we can serve you all over the world. So maybe take somebody that's almost as good as you think they are, but who can operate and help you figure out how to run your business globally. And he said to me, look, if you decide you don't want to be global fast, we will still work for you. You will be the favorite tool we use in our Atlanta office, but don't mess this up. And I decided at that point that there was so much urgency to be, I tested it with other people, obviously, but I decided there was so much urgency to be global that the best path to that would be to sell to a global company, that really had it figured out. There are lots of details around why we needed to be acquired in order to be global, but it was mostly that we had become a technology-enabled services company, so that we needed people in the countries who understood what a consumer would mean when they said, I don't know, I love American Idol. Like, we know what that means in the United States, but we don't know what that means in Istanbul.
Right.
So we needed people who lived in the various countries in order to scale. And we also needed it in terms of business development. So I found an investment banker, and he said to me, look, Diane, because we were doing really well. So it's not like we had to sell. We had a lot of great brands. And he said to me, look, the characteristics of your business are great. You're doubling in size every year. You have this logo chart of companies that you work with that is outrageously impressive, and your customer retention is really high. And I think you could really, really do well here. I think you could have your pick. And for me, it wasn't about the number necessarily. It was about, would we have some control over who we sold to? So Peter, the investment banker, and he basically said, look, you're not quite ready yet. We don't have to kind of go out there and be desperate, but let's do some fireside chats. And so we went on the road, and he just basically called up everybody who he knew in the industry who might be a potential acquirer. So he'd call you and say, Keith, I've got this company. They are absolutely crushing it. And the CEO and the leadership team are thinking about selling the company, but they're not sure. But I think you should take a look at them and just hear their story. No obligation, and they're probably not ready to have a serious conversation. That's how he would set it up. And I went around and I met everybody. And I told the story, and after every meeting, I would look at him and say, I love those people. Put them on the list, or that guy was, what a jerk. Right. I don't care what the guy would pay. I don't care how global they are. I don't want to be a part of that company. So it got us a lot of visibility, but it also gave me a chance to really think through where we might belong and what kind of company we might be a part of. So that's how it started. And then, eventually, we kind of put a book together. And when people got the book about us from our investment bankers, they already knew the company, they knew me, and we had about a dozen companies bidding on us. So it was great. And in the end, we didn't go for the highest bidder. We our venture investors were fantastic. And I kept saying to them, please, you're going to do so well in this deal. Don't abandon us. Don't leave us with a company, that is not going to help us to thrive. So we ultimately picked Omnicom, and it was a great run. They not only helped us be global, but they helped us acquire a lot more capability. We bought a company in London, bought a company in China, et cetera. In fact, the company that we bought in London, the CEO of that company is the person who I ultimately picked to be my successor. So good stuff.
Yeah, it's great to hear an outcome like that, where there are lots of acquisitions that get sunset and wind down and don't quite work out, but it just seemed like it was a perfect fit. And I like hearing your process that you ran. I don't know if I've ever heard that type of story, at least on this podcast. So I just think there's always question marks of entrepreneurs of like how do you run a process, or like, does it just magically happen? So I think it's just helpful to hear how others have gone through it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I give credit to Peter Lombard, who was at Piper Jaffray at the time. He's now Piper Sandler. I mean, he had this idea, and it was fantastic for me. And I always say to people, you're way, way better. If you're going to sell your company, you should sell it to somebody that already knows you well, and do it at a time when you're not desperate. Because again, I was in that process thinking, if I don't get the price I want from the company that I want, we'll try something else. We'll figure it out.
Right. All right. Well, your role these days, like you're an investor, right? But you sit on a lot of boards. It seems like that's probably where you spend a lot of your time now.
I do. Yeah. I loved being CEO. I did it at Communispace. I left. I CEO'd Startup Institute. I, did a bunch of things like that. But there were a couple of things that happened to me around 2016. One is I was starting to realize how much I missed the market research industry. Market research sounds really geeky, but it's a great space because your product is so compelling. I mean, say to any CEO, I have some, do you have 10 minutes? I have some really interesting information for you about your customers. You'll get the 10 minutes.
Right.
So I loved what a difference that made, especially in the boardroom and in the C-suite. And I was kind of missing it. That was in the back of my mind. But I got a phone call from a friend of mine back in that industry saying, Diane, he was head of strategy for the Clinton campaign, 2016. And he said to me, I'm just wondering if I can pick your brain. We're trying to understand voters, especially right now, undecided voters in swing states. We have tons of data about what they believe and how they're going to vote, but we don't understand a lot about why. And I thought maybe you'd have some ideas. So I'm like, do I have ideas? Blah, 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 blah. And we ended up spending a couple hours on the phone. And long story short, it was kind of one of those offers you couldn't refuse. I got an opportunity to help do a project for the Clinton campaign to basically do what I just mentioned, help them understand undecided voters in swing states. And I had to leave my job in order to do that. So I gave my board about 60 days notice and moved from all of that time running companies and being with people and, calling on customers and flying all over the place to sitting in my North End apartment, calling voters in Michigan, trying to understand why they couldn't decide between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And again, same thing, right? Back to General Foods on Brim, understanding people who are different from me, and then building a company to help brands really understand their customers. And then kind of moving into this, I just loved doing that research. And it was very inspiring to be part of that effort. It was also extremely frustrating. But at the end of the campaign, when the election was over, I was going to take another CEO job. I was trying to decide between two different ones. And while I was in process and talking to people, I wrote an op-ed for the Boston Globe that basically said, here's what I've been doing with voters, and here's what I've learned, and here's what I think it means. And the op-ed went viral. Because Jake Tapper of CNN picked up on it, and he couldn't stop talking about what I wrote about, which was basically that the turning point among my voters for Hillary Clinton was not Jim Comey talking about her emails. It was when she basically said that you could put half of Trump supporters into a basket of deplorables. And people went crazy and hated that comment. Anyway, I wrote all about that. The thing went viral, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm making more of a difference after the election than before. So I made a decision not to take either CEO job, and instead to design my professional life so that I could take a chunk of it, like a third, and figure out how to do something with understanding the American voter. And then I started joining some other boards, partially so the income could come in, but also so that I have stuff to do professionally. And I kind of created a portfolio life, which was spending about a third of my time where I basically recruited 500 voters, this time not undecided, just all points along the political spectrum, every age, every ethnicity, every state. And I did a 4.5-year longitudinal study of the American voter, ended up writing a column for the Globe and eventually a book. So that was about a third of my time. And then about a third of my time, I started doing a lot of angel investing. And then about a third of my time where I started picking up board work, which is now a massive amount of my time because I'm on more boards. And it's fun to have a portfolio life because you can continually optimize. You can, on a weekly basis, sit back and say, what do I love about what I'm doing? And, what is not working? Do I need to get off of a board? Do I need to stop this project? Do I need to kind of change what my priorities are or whatever? So when you have a portfolio life, which is a great thing to do later in your career, you can do a lot of giving back. Yet you can still kind of stay in the arena and make things better and better.
Yeah, I mean, you're on the board of Brightcove, Eastern Bank, Panera Bread. I won't list them all, but how did someone get on the radar for board seats? Like, I'm sure there's people I mean, it's obvious when you're a successful entrepreneur, CEO, and you have a great exit, but what can if you're a chief operating officer or a chief product officer, like how do you get on the visibility for board seats, and like how do we, diversify the board seats too?
Yeah. Well, look, I didn't go from no boards to Panera. Right? I mean, so some of it is if you're not in a CEO or maybe like a chief financial officer position, because people love having CFOs on boards, they can run the audit committee.
Mm,
It's good to just the first step is just dive in and get board experience. There are three categories: nonprofits, private companies, public companies.
right.
Public companies are super time consuming. They pay you well, you get stock, etc. Private companies pay you less, but very often you can be in a big private company owned by a private equity firm that's getting ready to go public, which is fun. You can be on the board of a startup and be an independent director that has a lot of expertise there. You don't get paid as much there, but you get some equity and you get a chance to kind of jump in and really, really feel like you're helping the leadership team. And then, of course, there are nonprofits, which are full of inspiration. But what nonprofits want, if you're on the board, is they want you to write checks and they want you to get all your friends to write checks.
Right.
So having experience in those makes a big difference. And I think you start learning, do I like being on boards? Do I have the patience? Do I have the skill? Do I have the perspective? And kind of what's my lane, right? Why would somebody bring me onto a board? I learned that my lane was really go-to-market strategy, that people bring me onto boards when they need help with marketing and sales and channels and consumer insight and all of that. It doesn't mean I can't read financial statements. It's just not what the big gap is when they say, gee, that's the hole that Diane could fill. And then for me, everything else is networking. I never got a board seat from a headhunter. I always had somebody pick up the phone and say, hi, we have this opening. What do you think? Or hi, you don't know me. I have this opening and your friend so-and-so said that I should talk to you, or whatever. It's all just been about networking. And yeah, go into the events, right? I mean,
Yeah.
helping people out, doing the mentor thing, judging the business plan competition, picking up the phone, saying yes, doing all of those things, not because maybe someday that person will give you a board seat, just because, as we used to say, that's what you do. If you want to build real value, my Rolodex right now is way more valuable than my Harvard MBA. I just feel like I have such great connections and I can be really helpful to people. They can be helpful to me. And, I've learned not only how to network, but, my male friends have taught me how to network like men, right? Women get together and we go, oh, I love your outfit. Oh, I love your earrings. That's so great. How are the kids? Blah, 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 blah. I've learned from my male friends, it's like guys get together and they go, hi, my daughter needs a job next summer. Can you hire her?
Right.
Or I'm raising money for blah, 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 blah. I need you to give me a check for $10,000. I mean, they transact. And I've learned how to do that also. I mean, to really be able to leverage the relationships I have. And, hopefully people feel like it's worth doing that with me.
All right. So you recently gave a commencement address at Northeastern for one of the schools. So
Yeah.
what was that experience like?
I think giving a commencement address is absolutely terrifying. It's the third time I've done it, and it doesn't get any easier. The thing that's hard about it is you get like 10 minutes. I mean, everybody's there to get their diploma and have dinner with their parents and cheer their friends. So
Right.
you can give them words of wisdom, but I don't know if I have anything that with all of the perspective that I have in life, I didn't know if I had anything that was so important to say that, everybody was going to be at the edge of their seats. So how do you write something in 10 minutes that you feel, will maybe be memorable or whatever? And it's very hard to do. If they said take a half hour is easy. You go, here are my 10 lessons. Here are three
Right.
stories. No, here are 3 stories, 5 lessons, 1 joke. and one thing that you should never do or whatever. I mean, I think a half hour is pretty easy, but, when they say 8 to 10 minutes, that's tricky. Having said that, I said yes all 3 times. And the reason is that it's really wonderful. Commencement is, commencement's like one of the great rituals. You're there, everybody's got the gowns on and the caps on, and the music is playing, and people feel an enormous sense of accomplishment, and it's emotional. So having the privilege of being a part of that is quite extraordinary. And sitting on the platform, in Matthews Arena, at Northeastern with
So cool.
3,500 people, and being able to just look at how everyone is relishing this moment is, you just get caught up in it. And, I just didn't want to miss that opportunity. It's funny, Keith, I was a trustee at Tufts for 10 years, and I've just moved over. I've become trustee emeritus because my term was up. But one of the greatest things about being a trustee, I mean, we do so much good work, but one of the great things is that every year it's commencement, and you walk down with your fellow trustees, and it's 2023, so everybody claps for you. Like in my day, we didn't clap for the trustees, but you go down, you sit on the platform, and you look out at all of these students and their families, and I say, oh, holy shit, how did this happen? I mean, how did I go from, Norristown to this campus where it was so scary, to sitting up on this stage? I mean, my being on that stage is such an unlikely thing. And being able to be in a position where you're reminded of that it's an extraordinary thing. So it's worth taking the risk that your 8 minutes, might not inspire everybody.
Yeah, but you created every accomplishment. Like the theme I got from this conversation is you're driven and you create opportunity, right? You finish Tufts in 3 years because you knew you could get that 4th-year loan at an MBA program and only have 1 year of school to pay. It's just like, then you knew you wanted to run a company. That, like, everything, you were very driven and methodical, and you created your own opportunities, whether it was networking and visibility amongst the techs. So when I think of the Boston tech scene, there's a lot of people, but you're definitely one of the anchors of people that supported it, not only from building a great company, but helping others build great companies too.
Oh, thank you. That really means a lot to me. I mean, here's how I would say it. I think that not knowing what you want to do and not knowing what's next is an enormous advantage if you can live with it and not be paralyzed by the uncertainty. So if we go back to my brother was very clear about what he wanted to do, became a surgeon, and he was driven and went directly on that path for his entire life. And if somebody would say to him, gee, have you thought about ever trying this? My brother would look at them like they're crazy. Like, you gotta be kidding. I'm doing throat cancer. This is my life's work. For me, because I didn't know, and for me now, I mean, I'm not retiring. I don't know what's next. I knew something would show up. And sometimes, even when I was doing what I loved, sometimes things would show up, and I would look to the left or look to the right or say, wow, I wonder if I can fit that in. Or I wonder if maybe I ought to get off at this path and try something else. So I think it was more because I didn't know what was next. I had to set my life up so that serendipity would happen, so that things would come at me that might be really interesting opportunities. And it taught me to listen hard to those opportunities. It taught me, honestly, to go for stuff that I never got, right? I mean, I applied for a college president job, and about 3 years ago, actually right before COVID, and I didn't get it. And I was crushed. I mean, I literally was planning what I was going to do as president of that university. And I was a finalist, but I didn't get it. I remember the first board I was ever on was Crabtree and Evelyn, which is the women's, kind of like Bath and Body Works and all that. I don't know if you know Crabtree and Evelyn, but
of
at
course.
one point, and it was owned by a friend of mine from business school. He called me one day from the Hong Kong airport. I had written another book. He goes, Diane, I'm in the Hong Kong airport and I've read your book, which was all about how you focus on your customers. And he says to me, I need you to be on my board. I just bought Crabtree and Evelyn for my wife. And I said, boy, did you buy a store for your wife?
Right.
He goes, no. I bought all
the whole
the
company.
stores. And that was my first for-profit board. And I think I was a really valuable board manager. I loved doing it. I had every Crabtree. I mean, it was like all over my bathroom. I had all their products. And at one point, I thought I had a view of how we ought to grow the company. And I sat down with him and said, I think you want to make me CEO. And he didn't think that was a good idea. Right. So I've had lots of those. It's not like everything I did, every job I applied for, every opportunity I went for worked out. But I became unafraid of just giving it a try. And I'm grateful for never knowing and for always thinking and for learning at this point in my life to just trust that if I feel like there's not enough excitement or there's not enough risk or there's not enough learning or whatever else, that something else will show up and I just need to put my taxi light on.
So don't be bashful, right? Don't be afraid and ask, right? Like you might get the hard answer that maybe you don't want, like no,
Right.
but if you don't ask, you don't know, and just put yourself out there and go for it.
Yeah, definitely. And when I said I have to put myself in a position in which serendipity happens, I mean, here's the thing. How do you do that? I always say to people, you've got to say yes to things. Your friend says, Keith Klein's doing this VentureFizz event. Let's go.
Right.
I go, oh, it's freezing outside. I'm sitting here with my blanket. I'm watching Game of Thrones reruns. Like, I don't think so. Get dressed, put on your boots and go, because you never know. You never know who's going to be there. And so much of the time when you say to people, how did you end up where you are now? It was like that. It's like, well, I went to this VentureFizz event one night. I sat on a plane and talked to somebody. I went to this thing and I listened to a panel and it gave me an idea. A friend called, asked if I would help do this one thing and I got sucked in. I mean, it's just, that's how it happens. And that doesn't mean I don't spend my share of time, binge watching something or whatever else. But, serendipity is way more likely to happen, if you put your boots on and,
I love
take a
that.
chance.
Yeah, I love that because it's definitely something that my wife and I totally live by, and we have 2 teenage girls, and we totally try to instill that. It's all about putting yourself out there, like going to things, whether it's a sporting events, like the high school sports, just being involved, and you never know, right? Like take chances, take risks, and and networking. So it's just, hopefully give them some good guidance, but definitely similar to what you're talking about. All right. So a good book podcast recommendation that you would pass along to entrepreneurs, other than your own, of course.
Well, other than other than my own book. Well, I mostly read fiction. For a while there, I was like doing all this nonfiction stuff. And then, I just, I find that when I read fiction, I just get more engrossed. So the last book I read was Trust by Hernan Diaz, which actually is fiction. And there's a lot of business in it. but it's a great book. And I think it just got a Pulitzer Prize. And before that, I read Lessons in Chemistry, which I think is on the bestseller list, which is also really great. Podcasts other than yours. Well, the podcast that I've been listening to a lot, which is now about to end, is Still Watching. It's a Vanity Fair podcast, and they've looked at every episode of Succession.
Okay.
Because whenever you watch an episode of Succession, you want to talk about it with people. These two guys are brilliant and they're really funny. And so I guess I have one more episode where they're going to analyze what really happened in the finale. And the other podcast that just cracks me up is Smartless.
Okay, so everyone talks about that. I'm like, all right, I gotta,
do?
you know what? Well, it's a podcast I hear about constantly, yet I need to dive in, is my point, where I haven't listened to it yet. Like, I've listened to many podcasts that get recommended, but that's one where I love the people doing it. Like, absolutely love. I mean, they're amazing. So I just,
how can you not love?
How can I?
Sean Hayes,
Jason Bateman,
Will Arnett, Jason Bateman.
Totally.
And these guys are friends from way back. Like, we know them differently and everything, but they're just really funny. And but they do, the structure of their podcast is like the structure of yours. So in your podcast, maybe I don't want to listen every week because I don't want to hear what Diane Hessan has to say. I've heard her story a million times or whatever, but maybe I do want to hear Scott Friend or whatever else. So you can pick which episodes by the person you're interested in, and it doesn't really become obsolete. It's the same thing with Smartless. Maybe I don't want to hear Paul Anka, but maybe I do want to hear them interview like Joe Biden. And it's fun when they interview Joe Biden because they don't talk about policy. They go like, so what time do you go to bed at night? Right? Does Jill go to bed at the same time? You're in pretty good shape. Like, do you work out? What's your routine? I mean, it's fun stuff. And they're not dumb questions. They're like, oh yeah, here are a whole bunch of things I never really knew before. So, but you can pick, which people you're interested in. So there's a really hilarious one with Dana Carvey that I recommend.
Okay. He's hysterical. Yeah,
he's one of the funny, especially if you're old enough to remember Dana Carvey on Saturday Night Live. Just
church lady.
Yeah.
Well, him and David Spade have their own podcast interviewing Saturday Night Live, actors that have run through and comedians. That's the same type of thing. Where it's like I've burned through those because those two are funny, and obviously they're interviewing, Will Ferrell and just amazing, like, just people. So it's just hysterical. So
yeah.
And what do you like to do for fun outside of work?
What do I do for fun outside of work? I see my daughters and my grandchildren, and of course my husband. I'm lucky because our kids are all in Boston. They're all grown and they're all in Boston. So it's really great. I can see them pretty much whenever I want, and they don't have to come to my place and stay overnight because they live close by. What else? Hang with friends, play the piano, play golf, read, cook, take walks. I do a lot of different things. Yeah, awesome. I live in the South End in Boston. So, right now it's a really, really wonderful time of year to live in the city. I don't know why people go to the Cape when they can walk around, walk on the Esplanade and do the Harbor Walk and, go to SoWa and, go to the public gardens and everything during the summer. It's just a really wonderful time of year.
That's awesome. Well, Diane, thanks so much for taking the time to walk us through your background story. Obviously, all the great stories of building companies and obviously all the great advice along the way.
It was a lot of fun. Thanks, Keith.